Alaric did not ride to Celine's cottage because he cared about her. He rode because every accusation in the kingdom pointed to her door, and Alaric had learned over a long and bloody reign that rumors this clean never grew wild. Someone had planted them 2 nights before a royal wedding that would bind the night-born throne to the Ravencrest bloodline forever. The accusations had begun feeling less like truth and more like a script, and Alaric did not trust scripts he hadn't written himself. What he found when he finally pushed through the broken door of that forgotten cottage, expecting treason, expecting proof, expecting a girl who deserved to be punished, did not break his meticulously ordered world gently. It shattered it, and it made him cancel the wedding entirely. The needle caught the candlelight as the royal tailor drew it through the black ceremonial fabric, a slow, deliberate pull that filled the silence of the fitting chamber with the faintest whisper of thread against silk. Alaric stood perfectly still on the raised dais, staring straight ahead into the long gilded mirror. The man reflected back at him wearing a crown without expression and a wedding coat without warmth. He had been standing here for 40 minutes. He had not spoken in 20. Your Majesty, if you continue to hold your shoulders that way, the seam will pull across the back, the tailor murmured without looking up, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had dressed powerful men his entire life and learned never to tell them anything directly. Alaric rolled his jaw. He said nothing. Behind him, Isolde sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, one leg crossed over the other, her attention moving between the florist's parchment and her correspondence with the efficiency of someone managing a military campaign. She was beautiful in the way a winter palace was beautiful, magnificent, precisely arranged, and entirely uninviting. The Ravencrest delegation arrives tomorrow night, Isolde said without looking up. I need the Eastern Hall cleared of your guard rotation. My father prefers his own men during the rehearsal dinner. Then your father may communicate that preference to my head of security, Alaric said. I'm communicating it to you. So you are. She looked up then, briefly, reading his tone the way she read everything, calculating the distance between what was said and what was meant. Then she returned to her correspondence. This was how they had always spoken to one another, not warmly, not coldly, efficiently. The marriage had been arranged 3 years ago by advisors on both sides who understood that love was a luxury and bloodlines were a currency. Alaric did not love Isolde. Isolde did not love Alaric. They understood each other exactly, which was precisely why the arrangement was supposed to work. But in the 40 minutes Alaric had been standing on this dais, he had heard Celine Whitlock's name 7 times. She shelters rebels in the woods. Isolde's chief advisor, Lord Callan, had said it during the morning council, leaning over the table with the particular urgency of a man who had practiced the sentence beforehand. She practices forbidden blood magic. The village is afraid. A second advisor, confirming the first. Just slightly too quickly. She should be arrested before the ceremony, Your Majesty. Before the guests arrive. As a show of strength, Alaric had watched them across the council table. He had listened to every word. He had agreed to nothing. He stood now in front of the mirror, and he turned it over in his mind the way he turned over anything that unsettled him. Slowly, methodically, searching for the point where the logic cracked. Every accusation was polished. Every witness account was consistent in the way that rehearsed accounts were consistent, smoothed of the rough, contradictory edges that real memory always left behind. Every trail of evidence, when he had quietly followed it back through court records that afternoon, seemed to originate from within the same tight circle of men, all of them connected to Isolde's household. He looked at Isolde's reflection in the mirror. She was writing something now. Her pen moved with precision across the page. She did not look like a woman concealing a conspiracy. She looked like a woman who had never once in her life been asked to doubt the information placed in front of her. My advisors believe the Whitlock girls should be dealt with before the guests arrive, Alaric said. Isolde set down her pen. Then deal with her. You've met her? I've met the problem she represents. She folded the letter with clean, practiced creases. A peasant stirring rumors in a village 2 days before a royal wedding is not a complication I have patience for. Send soldiers, have her removed. Alaric looked at the mirror again, at the coat, at the crown, at the man who had ruled this kingdom for long enough to know that the word removed could mean many things depending on who spoke it. He stepped down from the dais. Your Majesty, the tailor began, alarmed, reaching for the unfinished seam. We're finished, Alaric said. He removed the wedding coat himself, set it across the tailor's table without ceremony, and crossed to the door. Behind him he heard Isolde exhale, a precise, controlled breath that communicated displeasure without conceding to it. The rehearsal is tomorrow evening, Alaric. I know when the rehearsal is. Then perhaps you might remember that disappearing into the countryside the night before your wedding is not the behavior the Ravencrest family is expecting from. I'm not going to the countryside, Alaric said, and paused at the door. I'm going to a village. There's a difference. He left before she could manufacture a reply. The night air outside the palace walls carried the particular chill of late autumn, the kind that moved through fabric as though the fabric wasn't there. The torches along the western courtyard threw long amber shapes across the cobblestones. 3 horses stood saddled and waiting in the shadow of the gate arch, and 3 men stood beside them. Rowan Drake, who had been Alaric's guard captain for 11 years, and had learned that when the king arrived without his ceremonial coat at this hour, questions were not useful. Victor Hale, quiet, observant, already reading the king's face and already drawing his own conclusions. Gareth Crow, youngest of the 3, who had not yet learned to hide the way his hand moved instinctively toward the hilt of his blade whenever something felt wrong, and something clearly felt wrong. No banners, Alaric said. No palace markings. We ride as travelers. Rowan handed him a plain riding cloak without comment. The 4 of them passed through the western gate as the palace bell struck the 10th hour, the sound rolling out across the dark valley below like something being counted down. Alaric did not look back at the palace lights. He looked ahead at the road that wound south through the forest toward the valley's far edge, toward the forgotten village at the kingdom's outermost margin, toward a small cottage that everyone in the royal court had apparently decided was the most dangerous address in the realm. He wanted to know why. He wanted to know who had decided that, and he wanted to see, with his own eyes, the girl they were so desperately afraid of. The horses moved into the dark, and that was where everything began to change. Alaric rode out expecting to find a criminal. What he found inside that cottage will change everything, the wedding, the throne, and everything he thought he knew about his own kingdom. The story is only getting started, and trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. If you're already hooked, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed so the next chapter finds you. Drop a comment below. Do you think Celine can be trusted? Tell me what you think is really going on. The door had been broken from the inside. That was the first thing Alaric noticed. Not forced inward by someone trying to enter. Broken outward, the wood splintered along the frame in the direction of escape. Someone inside this cottage had tried very hard to get out. Rowan's hand went to his blade without being told. Alaric pushed the door open the rest of the way and stepped through. The smell reached him before his eyes adjusted. Wildflowers and iron. The particular combination sat wrong in the chest, like a song played in the wrong key. Afternoon light still pressed through the lace curtains along the far wall, casting pale patterns across the floor, and for one suspended moment the cottage looked almost peaceful. Small clay pots lined the windowsills. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. A portrait of an older couple, painted with the careful, loving imprecision of someone who was not an artist but wanted very much to remember a face, hung above the cold fireplace. Then Alaric looked down. Boot prints. Heavy, wide, the tread pattern of armored men, 4 of them at minimum, moving in from the door and fanning out through the room with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had done this before. The rug near the center of the room had been shoved aside. A wooden chair lay on its side. One leg snapped clean off. A ceramic jug, the kind used for water or milk, had been smashed against the wall to the left, and the pieces had been left exactly where they fell. Nobody had cleaned up because nobody had expected to need to. And above the overturned chair bolted into the central ceiling beam with hardware far too deliberate for a cottage this modest hung 2 iron chains. The manacles at their ends were open. Alaric stood in the center of the room and looked at the chains for a long moment. He had ordered fortresses built. He had walked through the aftermath of battles. He was not a man easily disturbed by evidence of violence. But there was something about this room. The flowers still blooming in their pots, the portrait still hanging straight above the fireplace, the lace curtains still catching the afternoon light as though nothing had changed. That made the chains feel obscene in a way that a dungeon never would. "There," Rowan said quietly. She was in the corner beside the far window, half collapsed against the wall, her dark hair fallen across her face. Her wrists bound together above her with a length of rope looped over an iron hook Alaric had initially mistaken for something used to hang pots. Her feet barely touched the floor. Her head lolled forward with the particular heaviness of someone who had stopped fighting some time ago and was running now on whatever was left after the fighting ran out. This was the girl they had called dangerous. This was the sorceress, the rebel keeper, the threat to the crown. She was slight. She was barefoot. There was blood dried dark along the side of her face where something had struck her above the ear and a gag still pulled tight across her mouth. And she looked, in the fading afternoon light of her own vandalized home, like exactly what she was. Some powerful people had wanted very much to silence. "Get her down," Alaric said. Rowan moved immediately. Victor crossed to the back of the cottage, hand on his weapon, moving through the doorways systematically. Gareth swept the room, checked beneath the overturned furniture, and then went still near the back corner. A sharp, focused stillness that meant he had found something. Rowan cut the rope. The girl's weight dropped forward and he caught her, lowering her to the floor as the gag came loose. She drew a long, ragged breath, the kind pulled from the bottom of someone who had been rationing air. And then her eyes opened. They were dark, and they were terrified, and they were directly to Alaric's face. She scrambled backward against the wall so fast she reeled in something along her wrist, a thin line of red appearing against pale skin, and the sound she made was not a scream, but something worse. A held breath, a braced stillness, the silence of someone who had already learned that screaming didn't help. "I am not here to harm you," Alaric said. She stared at him, at his crown, at the royal coat he had not thought to remove, at Rowan and the blade still in his hand. She said nothing. "Your Majesty." Victor's voice came from the back room, flat and careful, carrying the particular weight of a man choosing his words. "You need to see this." Alaric crossed the cottage. Victor stood over a small pile of belongings that had been left carelessly, hastily, beneath the back window. A traveling pack, a water flask stamped with a crest Al recognized before he finished looking at it. A deep, cold thing settled in his chest. The crest belonged to Isolde's private household, not the Ravencrest family seal, not the kingdom's military mark. The private crest, the one used only by guards and agents who answered directly and exclusively to his future bride. From the back of the cottage, Gareth appeared in the doorway, one hand gripping the collar of a man in a plain riding coat, the man's face bloodied, his expression carrying the particular blankness of someone calculating how much silence was still worth. Gareth shoved him forward. The man hit the floor on his knees, raised his head, and looked at the vampire king standing in the ruins of a poor girl's home, and then he smiled. A thin, ugly, knowing smile, and spat blood onto the floorboards. She should have died before the wedding. The man didn't speak again after that. Alaric looked at him for a long moment, at the smile, at the blood on the floor. at the absolute certainty in the man's expression that he had already calculated his odds and made his peace with them, and then he turned to Gareth. "Secure him outside. Don't let him speak to anyone." Gareth hauled the man up by the collar and moved him through the door without ceremony. Rowan took a position at the cottage entrance. Victor began a second, more methodical search of the back rooms, opening every drawer, checking every wall for hollow sounds. Alaric turned back to Celine. She had pulled herself upright against the wall beneath the window, both arms drawn in close, her bound wrists pressed against her chest. Someone had taught her at some point to make herself smaller when danger was in the room. She was doing it now without seeming to notice she was doing it. He crossed the room, crouched down to her level, and held out his knife handle first toward Rowan, who understood and cut the remaining rope from her wrists without being asked. She did not say, "Thank you." She pulled her arms to her chest and looked at Alaric the way people looked at a fire, aware of the warmth, certain of the burn. "I need to know what happened here," Alaric said. "I'm sure you do." Her voice was rough, scraped thin, but the steadiness underneath it was deliberate, chosen. "You rode all this way. Who sent those men?" She looked at him for a moment that stretched past comfortable. Then she looked at the chain still hanging from the ceiling beam, and something moved through her expression. Not fear, but something older and more tired than fear. "I know better than to trust kings," she said. "You people don't notice villages like this one until someone gives you a reason to. Nobles whisper a poor girl's name in a palace corridor, and suddenly the king himself rides out." She met his eyes. "What does that tell you about how long the problem has been going on?" Alaric did not answer because she was not wrong, and he had enough self-possession to know that arguing with an accurate observation was the particular dishonesty of men who couldn't afford to examine themselves. "It tells me," he said instead, "that someone wanted me here looking at you instead of looking at them." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, not yet, but the particular recalibration of someone revising an assumption. He questioned the captured guard outside while Rowan cleaned and bound Celine's wrists with cloth torn from the cottage's least ruined curtain. The man was more forthcoming than Alaric expected, which meant someone had told him that if things went wrong, the story he told should be the one that did the most damage on its way out. Celine Whitlock, the man said, had stolen documents, correspondence, records, things that, if they reached the wrong years before the wedding, would unravel an arrangement that had taken 3 years to construct. "What kind of arrangement?" Alaric asked. The man smiled again, smaller this time. "The permanent kind." Alaric left him with Gareth and went back inside. Celine was sitting upright now, her back against the wall, a cup of water from Rowan's flask held between both bandaged hands. She watched Alaric come back through the door and set the cup down. "He told you about the documents," she said. It wasn't a question. "He told me you had them." "I do." She was quiet for a moment. "Then my father was a record keeper for noble tax shipments, the official ledgers that tracked what the villages owed to the great houses and what the great houses forwarded to the crown." She paused. "He was very good at his work, which was his misfortune. Good record keepers notice when numbers don't agree." Alaric sat down on the low bench across from her and waited. He found discrepancies. Not small ones, systematic ones. Entire villages taxed twice. The surplus recorded as loss to weather or illness, the difference moving into accounts that had no official name. Prisoners taken from border settlements recorded as deaths, moved through shipping routes. Falsified royal accounts across 6 noble houses, all of them coordinated, all of them operating with the assumption that no one at the crown's level was paying close enough attention. When did he find this? 8 years ago. She said it with the flatness of a number she had counted too many times. He was dead within the season. My mother 3 weeks after him. Bandits, the official report said. Very thorough bandits who took nothing and left no witnesses except a 12-year-old girl. Everyone assumed was too frightened to remember anything clearly. The afternoon light had shifted while she spoke, the lace curtains going from gold to gray. The cottage felt very quiet. I remembered everything clearly, Celine said. Gareth. Alaric didn't raise his voice. Gareth appeared in the doorway to the back room, crouching down, pressing his palm to a section of floorboards near the eastern wall, until one gave with a hollow sound. Beneath it, journals bound in oilcloth, coded correspondence, noble seals pressed into black wax, and ledgers filled with columns of numbers in two different hands, one neat, one desperate. 8 years of evidence. I gathered alone, hidden under the floor of a cottage that everyone in power had dismissed as beneath their notice. Victor picked up the first ledger, opened it, and went still. Many of these names, he said without looking up, are advisors to the Ravencrest household. Nobody spoke for a moment. Celine looked at Alaric with something in her face that was not triumph and not relief, but the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a truth too long to feel anything clean when someone finally believed it. I was never your enemy, she said. I was trying to reach you. I didn't know how to reach a king. She looked down at her bandaged wrists. Every path I found went through someone who worked for the people in those ledgers. Alaric looked at the pile of documents spread across the cottage floor, at the chains above them, at the portrait of 2 people above the fireplace who had been killed because a good man had done his job too well. There's one more, Celine said quietly. She reached beneath the collar of her blouse and drew out a folded piece of paper worn soft at the creases from years of handling. She held it out without looking at him. Alaric took it and opened it. The handwriting was different from the ledgers, older, slower, the hand of a man writing something he understood might be the last true thing he ever recorded. 7 words in his father's writing at the bottom of the page. The Ravencrest wedding will crown the traitors. They worked by candlelight. Rowan barricaded the door with the cottage's heaviest furniture and took the first watch at the window. Victor organized the documents into categories on the cleared floor. Ledgers here, correspondence there. Sealed letters in a separate pile that none of them had yet opened because of the wax on several bore marks that made even Victor pause before breaking them. Celine sat cross-legged among the papers, moving through them with the efficiency of someone who had read them before and was now reading them again for someone else's benefit. She had refused the offer of the cottage's one remaining chair. Alaric suspected she refused it because accepting anything from him still cost her something she wasn't ready to spend. He let her keep the floor. He sat beside her and read. By the second hour, the shape of it was clear. The marriage itself was the mechanism, not the destination. The door. The moment Alaric signed the royal marriage contract, a sequence of pre-drafted emergency decrees would be presented to him in the days immediately following, each one framed as a routine administrative consolidation, each one transferring a specific category of authority: military command structure, palace security rotations, crown tax collection, into the hands of Ravencrest-aligned nobles who had spent 3 years positioning themselves in exactly the right offices. Individually, each decree looked like paperwork. Together, they were a cage. Once isolated from his loyal commanders, Victor read aloud from a letter in careful bureaucratic language that made the words sound worse for their calmness. The transition of symbolic versus functional authority can be managed within a single administrative quarter. Symbolic versus functional. A king who wore the crown while other men made the decisions. Or, if he proved resistant to the arrangement, a king who had an unfortunate accident, or a sudden illness, or simply disappeared into a grief that nobody could quite explain. Alaric set the letter down. Isolde, he said. Celine looked up from the ledger in her lap. Some of it she knew, some of it she didn't. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one. She pulled a letter from the correspondence pile and held it out. This one was written to her directly, 3 months ago. It references Celine Whitlock by name and describes her as a threat requiring removal before the ceremony. She paused. She signed the response. Alaric read the response. It was 4 lines. It did not authorize violence explicitly. It authorized resolution, which was the kind of word people use when they wanted to give an order they could later claim not to have given. And this one, Celine said, drawing out a second letter, was written by Lord Varon Ravencrest, her uncle, to 2 other council members the same week. It describes Isolde as unaware of the full scope and advises keeping her that way until after the wedding. She set it beside the first. She knew enough to sign away my safety. She didn't know enough to understand what the larger plan would cost her. Villain or pawn? Rowan said from the window, not turning around. Neither, Celine said. A woman who wanted power badly enough to stop asking questions about where it was coming from. There's a word for that. Alaric didn't offer one. He sat with both letters in his hands and thought about the petitions. The village complaints that had reached his council over the past 4 years. Excessive taxation, missing persons reported as criminal departures, land seizures attributed to debt. All of them reviewed by advisors who had summarized them as exaggerated, localized beneath the crown's direct attention. All of them, he now understood, reviewed by men whose names appeared in these ledgers. He had trusted the summary instead of reading the petition. He had governed the kingdom through a filter held by the people stealing from it. The candles had burned low when Gareth, positioned at the cottage's rear, said one word: movement. They came fast, 6 men, no torches, moving in the practiced darkness of people paid not to be seen. Rowan met the first 2 at the door with the overturned table as a brace and his blade in his hand. Victor swept the documents into the oilcloth and pressed himself against the far wall. Gareth lifted Celine by the arm and moved her toward the back room without asking her permission, which she objected to briefly and then abandoned when something struck the shuttered window hard enough to crack the frame. Alaric stepped into the doorway. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need one. What he was underneath the crown and the coat and the careful political performance of a king who governed by paperwork. What he had always been, before the throne taught him to be something quieter, moved through the cottage doorway and into the dark with a swiftness that had nothing human in it. It was brief. It was absolute. When Rowan lowered his blade and Victor opened the back door and the night went quiet again, one man remained alive, barely, and not by design, but by the particular accident of having fallen at an angle that made him difficult to reach without stepping over someone else. Alaric crouched beside him. Who sent you? The man's breathing was shallow. He looked up at Alaric with the expression of someone who had known, taking this job, that there was a version of tonight that ended here. She was supposed to be dead by sunrise, he said. You were never supposed to see her. Who gave that order? But the man's eyes had already moved to the middle distance where answers no longer mattered. Alaric stood. The dawn was beginning at the tree line, a thin gray line pressing against the dark. In a few hours the palace bells would ring for the wedding morning. Guests would be dressing. The cathedral would be filled with flowers and nobles and the particular self-satisfied atmosphere of powerful people watching power consolidate. On the cottage table among the documents Victor had swept back into order sat the wedding invitation Alaric had carried in his coat pocket for 3 days. Heavy cream paper, black ink, sealed in black wax pressed with the Ravencrest crest. He picked it up. I turned it over. Then, he said quietly, to no one in particular and to all of them at once, I will attend my wedding with the truth. The cathedral was magnificent in the way that only old power could manufacture. Stone-vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound and returned it as echo columns, dressed in white silk and silver chain. 10,000 candles burning in formations that had taken the palace staff 3 days to arrange. The guests filled every pew to the transept. Foreign envoys in their delegations' colors, noble houses in their finest, soldiers lining the walls in ceremonial armor, polished to mirrors. Everyone had come to watch history settle into place. Isolde stood at the altar in ivory and pearl, her gown constructed with the same precision she brought to everything. No excess, no softness, every seam a decision. Her blonde hair was dressed with a silver coronet. Her hands were still. She had the particular composure of a woman who had rehearsed this moment so many times that the emotion had been refined entirely out of it, leaving only the performance. The cathedral murmured with the low, expectant sound of 300 people waiting for a door to open. The door opened. Alaric entered first. No processional music. He had not given the signal for it, and the choirmaster reading the room had made the correct instinctive decision to remain silent. Rowan followed on his left, Victor on his right, Gareth a step behind, and beside Gareth, wrapped in a plain traveling cloak that had no business being inside a royal cathedral, walked Celine Whitlock. The murmur became something else. It moved through the pews in a wave. Confusion first, then recognition, then the particular sharp intake of collective breath that a crowd produces when something has gone wrong that it doesn't yet have language for. Heads turned, voices dropped to urgent whispers. A foreign envoy leaned to his aid. A noble in the third pew stood halfway up before his wife pulled him back down. Isolde's eyes found Celine across the length of the cathedral and went very still. Her chief advisor, Lord Kalin, materialized from the front pew and stepped into the aisle with the smooth urgency of a man who had prepared for contingencies. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the careful register of public calm over private alarm, "the girl is a wanted criminal. Whatever circumstance has brought her here." "Sit down, Callan," Alaric said, not loudly. He didn't need volume. The cathedral's acoustics carried it to the back wall, and something in the tone, something that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with what Alaric was underneath the ceremony, settled over the room like a temperature drop. Kalen sat down. Alaric walked the length of the aisle. He did not look at Isolde yet. He stopped at the altar steps and turned to face the assembled court, and he waited until the last whisper died, and there was nothing in the cathedral but candlelight and silence. Then he began. He started with the forged testimonies, the witness accounts against Celine, each one traced back to its origin. Each origin connected to a name, each name connected to a household that appeared in the ledgers Victor now carried. He named the villages that had been taxed twice. He named the prisoners recorded as deaths. He named the 6 noble houses who had stolen from the crown's poorest subjects for 8 years while sitting in the crown's council and advising restraint toward the very people they were destroying. He described what had been done to Celine in her cottage. He described the chains. He named the guard they had captured and the household crest found among his belongings. The cathedral had gone absolutely still in the way that large spaces go still when the people inside them are afraid to move. Then he turned to Isolde. She met his eyes without flinching, which he had expected. What he had not expected was the grief underneath the composure. Not for him, not for the wedding, but the particular grief of a person watching the architecture of their life develop cracks they had always known were there and chosen repeatedly not to examine. "Did you know?" he asked. The question was quiet. The cathedral heard every word of it. "I knew there were complications," Isolde said. Her voice was steady. Her hands at her sides were not. "I was told she was a threat. I was told it was being managed." "You signed the order." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to answer the question without answering it. "I trusted my advisors," she said. "You trusted the men stealing from my kingdom because trusting them was convenient," Alaric said. "And a girl's life was the price of that convenience." 3 rows back, a man in raven crest colors stood and moved toward the side door. Victor was already watching him. A gesture from Alaric, and Rowan intercepted the aisle. 2 more attempted the rear exit. Gareth had anticipated it. Alaric reached into his coat and removed the wedding invitation, cream paper black wax, and set it on the altar beside the ceremonial ring he had been given at the rehearsal. The one he had not yet placed on his finger because some instinct had told him even then to wait. He looked at the ring for a moment. Then he looked at the court. "This wedding is cancelled." The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water, and the silence shattered outward in every direction at once. Voices, movement, the scrape of pews, someone crying out from the Ravencrest delegation. The sharp sound of Isolde's composure finally cleanly breaking. And beneath all of it, from the rear of the cathedral, came a sound that ended every other sound immediately. The great doors slammed shut. And in the sudden, ringing quiet that followed, the nearest soldiers, the ones in Ravencrest colors, the ones who had been standing at the walls all morning waiting for a signal, drew their weapons. Rowan moved before the second weapon cleared its scabbard. He had spent 11 years reading rooms for the king, and he had read this one the moment they walked through the doors. The spacing of the Ravencrest guards along the walls. The particular stillness of men waiting for a signal rather than standing at ceremony. He had counted 14. He had said nothing because saying something would have changed the timing, and the timing needed to belong to Alaric. Now the timing belonged to everyone. Loyal soldiers, to me, Rowan said, and his voice in the cathedral acoustics carried the absolute authority of a man who had never once in his life needed to say anything twice. Half the room erupted. The other half chose in the space of 3 seconds which half they belonged to. Victor was already moving, not toward the fighting, toward the side door that connected the cathedral's vestry to the palace's internal corridor network. The royal archives sat 2 floors above the council chamber, and if Varen's people had thought far enough ahead to lock the cathedral doors, they had thought far enough ahead to send men to destroy the evidence before anyone could use it. Victor had the oilcloth bundle of documents under his arm and a look on his face that suggested profound sympathy for anyone who tried to stop him. Gareth put himself between Celine and the nearest Ravencrest guard without being asked, which she objected to with a sharp word that he ignored with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned to distinguish between objections that required response and objections that required. He simply continued doing what he was doing. Alaric walked through the cathedral's side door. Not run. I walked. The fighting organized itself around him and behind him the way weather organizes itself around a fixed point. And he moved through the corridor beyond with the particular focused calm of someone who had already decided where he was going and what would happen when he arrived. He had known Varen Ravencrest for 6 years. He had sat across from him in council. He had read the man's recommendations and, on more occasions than he would now comfortably count, followed them. Varen was 70 years old, silver-haired and possessed of the kind of patient intelligence that disguised itself as wisdom, until you understood that wisdom required a conscience and patience required only time. The council chamber door was unlocked. Varen stood at the head of the long table, his back to the tall window, his hands clasped behind him. He was still wearing his ceremonial court clothes. He looked, at first glance, like a man who had been waiting calmly. At second glance, he looked like a man who had planned for this room to be his last move on the board. "You're faster than I estimated," Varen said. "I expected the cathedral to hold you longer. You underestimated Rowan. I underestimated several things." He looked at Alaric with the dispassionate assessment of a man revising a calculation. "Not you, though. You I estimated correctly. A king who governs at sufficient distance never sees the mechanisms beneath him. You sat on that throne for 12 years and never once rode to a village yourself." He tilted his head slightly. "I built an empire in the space your absence created. And Celine's parents?" Something moved through Varen's expression, not guilt, but the mild displeasure of a man reminded of an administrative necessity he had found distasteful. "Her father was meticulous," Varen said. "It was his most unfortunate quality." The door behind Alaric opened. Celine walked in, and Gareth walked in behind her with the expression of a man who had tried to prevent this and accepted his failure with dignity. She was still in the traveling cloak, still pale from the previous night, and she was carrying the oilcloth journal with both bandaged hands and looking at Varen Ravencrest with 8 years of accumulated clarity. "You wrote to my father 3 weeks before he died," she said. You told him his discrepancies had been reviewed and found to be errors. You told him his employment was secure. She set the journal on the council table between them. He wrote that down too. He wrote everything down. Varen looked at the journal, then at her. A long, assessing look that ended in something almost resembling respect. You have your father's instincts, he said. It's a pity about the circumstances. Don't, Alaric said quietly. Don't speak to her. The door opened a third time. Isolde stood in the frame. She had removed the coronet. Her wedding gown was incongruous in the hard light of the council chamber. All that ivory and pearl in a room that smelled of old wood and political machinery. She looked at her uncle across the table, and her face had the quality of someone reading a document they had suspected existed for years and hoped they never had to find. The passage, she said. Her voice was very controlled. Behind the eastern panel. It connects to the stable road. She looked at Alaric. He used it during my father's tenure when council sessions became inconvenient. I watched him use it once when I was 12, and he told me I had imagined it. She looked back at Varen. I didn't imagine it. Varen moved for the eastern wall. Alaric was faster. What followed was brief and not ceremonial and left the eastern panel in splinters and Lord Varen Ravencrest on the council chamber floor with Alaric's hand at his collar and the absolute, ringing stillness of a man who had finally run out of board. Alaric looked down at him. I'm not going to kill you here, he said. You don't get the privacy of that. He hauled Varen upright by the front of his court coat and turned him toward the door, where Rowan had appeared with 4 loyal guards and the particular expression of a man who had won the cathedral and come looking for the next problem. Bring the surviving council, Alaric said. Every noble who drew a weapon, every guard who closed those doors. Bring them all. He looked at Varen. You're going to tell them everything. Every name, every arrangement. Every village you taxed twice, and every account you falsified, and every person you decided was too small to matter. His voice dropped to the register that had nothing ceremonial left in it. And you're going to do it in front of witnesses, because I want it on record in every archive in this kingdom, and I want every man who trusted you to hear it from your mouth. Varen said nothing for a long moment. Then, with the resignation of a man who recognized a position with no remaining moves, he began. The names came one by one, each one landing in the chamber like something being dropped from a height, and Rowan's guards recorded every word. And by the time Varen finished, there was not a man left in the room who did not understand exactly how long and how thoroughly the kingdom had been hollowed out from within. Alaric looked at the list. Arrest them, he said. All of them. Varen is in chains. The traitors are named, but the hardest part of the story isn't the battle. It's what comes after it. One chapter remains, and it's the one that will stay with you. Selene still doesn't fully trust him. Alaric still has a debt he doesn't know how to repay. And the kingdom has to decide what it's actually built on. If this story hits differently than you expected, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Chapter 7 is the one that matters most. The trials took 3 weeks. Varen Ravencrest was stripped of his title, his lands, and the particular dignity he had spent 70 years constructing, and he faced the crown's judgment in the same council chamber where he had confessed, before witnesses who had recorded every word and ensured that no version of events could be quietly revised afterward. 5 noble houses were dissolved. 11 advisors lost their positions. 14 guards faced a military tribunal. The royal archives, which Victor had successfully protected at the cost of a deep cut along his forearm that he refused to have looked at until the documents were secured, provided sufficient evidence to prosecute every name on Varen's list and several he had omitted until the ledgers made omission pointless. The villages received restitution. It was paid from the seized estates of the houses that had taken it, which was not poetic justice so much as the only mathematically coherent solution. and Alaric signed the restitution orders himself rather than routing them through an administrative layer he no longer trusted on instinct. Selim's parents were formally cleared. The official record of their debts was amended. Bandit attacks struck through, replaced with the accurate accounting, their names restored to the kingdom's honest ledger, alongside the names of every other person the conspiracy had tried to disappear. It was a small gesture against a large crime. Alaric understood that. He signed it anyway because small gestures done honestly were more valuable than large ones done for appearance, and he was trying, with some difficulty, to learn the difference. Isolde left the capital on a grey morning 2 weeks after the cathedral. She had not been charged. The evidence supported manipulation and willful incuriosity, which were moral failures rather than criminal ones, and Alaric had decided that the kingdom's courts had enough to process without adjudicating the precise boundaries of ambition. She accepted the exile without argument, which told him more about her self-knowledge than anything she had said in the cathedral. She paused at the palace gate long enough to turn back once, and Alaric, watching from the upper corridor window, thought she looked less like a woman defeated and more like a woman beginning the long, uncomfortable work of understanding herself. He hoped, without great confidence, that she would finish it. He rode to the village alone, not entirely alone. Rowan was somewhere on the road behind him, close enough to matter and far enough to understand that some things required the appearance of privacy even when privacy was an illusion. The autumn had deepened in the weeks since the trials, the trees along the southern road gone to amber and rust, the air carrying the particular clean cold of a season in the process of ending. The cottage looked different in the daylight, without urgency pressing over everything. The door had been replaced, new wood. Same simple frame, hung straight on hinges that didn't protest. The window shutters had been repaired. Someone had swept the path. On the sill, in the same clay pots that had survived the night of the chains, flowers still bloomed in the stubborn, indifferent way that living things bloom when no one has gotten around to stopping them. Celine was sitting on the front step. She watched him dismount and tie the horse to the fence post and walk toward her, and she had the expression she had been wearing in various forms since the night he found her. Not hostile, not warm, but the careful assessment of someone who had learned at significant personal cost that first impressions of powerful people were almost always the accurate ones, and second chances were a luxury extended only to those who could afford to be wrong. "You didn't send word you were coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd be here if I did." She considered this with the neutrality of someone declining to confirm or deny it. He stopped a few feet from the step and looked at the cottage. At the repaired door, the swept path, the flowers on the sill, and then at the woman sitting in front of it who had spent 8 years alone in this building, gathering evidence that could bring down half the kingdom's nobility, feeding it to a system that kept returning it to the people it implicated, waiting for a door to open that nobody had any particular motivation to open. "You saved this kingdom," he said, "a kingdom that gave you no protection, no advocate, and no reason to believe it was worth saving." Celine looked at the path between them. "I didn't do it for the kingdom. I know. You did it for your parents." He paused. "That makes it more honest than most things that happen in royal councils." She was quiet for a moment. "The kingdom believed me," she said, "when you stood beside me. Not before. Everything I had, the journals, the ledgers, the 8 years, none of it was enough. Until a king walked into a cathedral with me at his side." She looked up at him. "You should know that. You should remember that the next time a petition comes through your council from a village you haven't visited." "I will," Alaric said. "I intend to visit more villages. That's a low standard. It's a starting point." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded document, official paper, the crown's seal pressed in dark wax at the bottom. He held it out. "Royal investigator," he said. "Independent authority to examine noble accounts, tax records, and village petitions without routing through the council. You report directly to me. You go where the evidence takes you. You speak for the villages in rooms where villages have never had a voice. He paused. It's not charity. The palace has never had anyone remotely qualified to do this work, and you've been doing it without a title for 8 years. She looked at the document without taking it immediately, which was exactly what he had expected. And if my investigations implicate people you're politically obligated to protect? She asked. Then I will be politically uncomfortable, Alaric said. And justice will be served, and I will survive the discomfort. She took the document. She didn't open it. She held it in both hands and looked at the cottage door behind her. The new wood, the straight hinges, the ordinary morning light coming through the repaired window, and something in her face moved through a sequence of things that were private and complex and none of his business, and he waited without rushing it. Then she stood up from the step. They stood together in front of the restored cottage in the amber autumn light, and Alaric looked at the door he had first pushed open expecting to find a criminal, and instead found the cost of his own long distance from the truth. He had come here the first time looking for betrayal. He had found something the kingdom had spent 8 years trying to bury. Not a threat, not a sorceress, not a poor girl too small to matter. He had found the only person in the realm who had never stopped telling the truth. The kingdom had prepared for a royal wedding. It had dressed the cathedral in silk and silver and filled it with the self-satisfied confidence of power arranging itself for posterity. Instead, it witnessed the birth of a different reign, one built not on bloodlines and arrangements and the careful management of what kings were permitted to see, but on truth and the quiet, undefeatable courage of a girl that nobody had believed.